Awake, O dead, for there can be no rest for ye beneath the earth. Let the splintered bones burrow from the grave pole. Let cold fingers grip time-worn blades, and unseeing eyes survey the fields of slaughter. For your time has come once more, and the dead shall walk again. The motto of the Sylvania Press. The Vampire Counts are amongst the most legendary factions of vampires to have ever terrorized the civilized lands of the old world, all of whom are members of the unholy von Carstein bloodline. From the imperial government and the patriotic citizenry of the empire, the Vampire Counts are considered by many to be fiends without equal. They seek only to topple the civilizations of the living and supplant them with an undead empire that will reign forever as Lords of the Night. The Vampire Counts are powerful necromancers as well as warriors, given supernatural enhancements to their strength, cunning, beauty, and ambition. However, these vampires, for all their power and cunning, are ultimately base, selfish creatures driven by the same motivations as the mortals they deem themselves superior to. They are remorseless in their advance, killing without thought of mercy or compassion, and whose motives are entirely based on their own selfish desires. For all their refinement, these vampires are nothing but rotting corpses held together by dark magic and the horrific consumption of mortal blood. From their power base within the former imperial province of Sylvania, the descendants of the von Carstein bloodline have tried repeatedly to topple the authority of the Empire. Since the time of Vlad von Carstein, it is the sole purpose of the family to inherit the Empire as their own, using attempts of legitimacy, assassination, and outright invasion to achieve their ambitions. Time and again, they have been pushed back towards Sylvania and hunted ceaselessly for their horrific machinations. Yet, no matter how many von Carsteins fall, there always seems to be another willing to take its place, disturbing the graves of the dead and plotting to finally plunge the Empire into their cruel tyranny. The origins of the Vampire Counts can be traced back to the origins of the vampire race. From the deserts of the far south, there once laid an ancient civilization that ruled unchallenged for many thousands of years. This ancient kingdom held the name of Nagash, a mighty human civilization that was once the pinnacle of mankind's achievements. Within those once verdant plains, the people of Nagash had lived a prosperous life amidst the many rival cities that dot its landscape. Massive temples and pyramids were built to honor the many long-dead priest kings that ruled this ancient kingdom and whose obsession to live forever led its many inhabitants on a dark pursuit for eternal life. Eventually, this obsession with achieving immortality would bring about Nehekara's demise and, from its death throes, the birth of the first vampire. Some 2,500 years before the birth of Sigmar, the ancient civilization of Nehekara dwelt along the banks of the great river Vitae. Of all the kings of Nehekara, none could match the splendor, cruelty, and arrogance of Setra, the first priest king of the city-state of Khemri. Under his inspired leadership and unparalleled ruthlessness, the other priest kings of Nehekara were eventually conquered and forced to pay tribute while acknowledging Khemri as the greatest city in the land. But Setra was unsatisfied, knowing that one day death would rob him of all he had accomplished. In his arrogance, he vowed that the grave would not claim him and proclaimed that he would cheat death, setting his wisest and most powerful priests to task working on a means of preventing his passing. Soon, all of Nehekara became preoccupied with death and the afterlife, resulting in the construction of many huge temples and monuments that were meant to honor the long deceased. These huge tombs became so frequent and massive in scale that the rulers were forced to gather them all into massive cities called necropoli. In the end, however, Setra could not evade death, and after living out the last fleeting years of his extended existence, he was eventually entombed within a vast pyramid. It was unto this culture that Nagash was born, the brother of the current reigning priest king of Khemri. Nagash was the first son of his father, the former priest king, and was given to the mortuary cult as tradition demanded. He soon rose to the position of high priest, where he observed the morticians as they prepared the dead for interment and learned all of their ancient magical lore. Yet Nehekara was far south from the northern winds of magic, and he was unable to cast them himself. Frustrated with this, Nagash went to great lengths to increase his knowledge of death magic, to such an extent that he took to unspeakable experiments in his quest for immortality. When word about this spread, nearly all the citizens of Khemri shunned him. But just then, a group of dark elves were blown off course and captured by the ships of the Zandri navy. These prisoners were given to Khemri as a gift to be sealed within the tomb of Nagash's dead father. When Nagash was told by a dark elven priestess that she would reveal all her knowledge of magic to him in exchange for her life, Nagash faked the dark elves' deaths and sealed them within his father's pyramid. Nagash reasoned with his captives. If the Dark Elves willingly revealed and taught Nagash all they knew about magic, he would release them from their prison. During his tutoring, the Dark Elves taught Nagash how to reap souls and use their energy to cast spells of his own without the need to channel the winds of magic. With this knowledge, coupled with many long years of research and experimentation, Nagash would become the founder and creator of a new form of sorcery, which he named necromancy. Even after the bargain was done, the Dark Elves were never seen again. Nagash's experiments met with limited success, as he was able to prolong his life and forestall the effects of aging, but he still could not stop the slow decay of his flesh. He shared his elixir with depraved noblemen, building support for himself before he finally killed his own brother and seized power in Khemri. He and his immortal supporters were tyrannical rulers, slaughtering many of the citizens of Khemri without provocation or reason. With their newfound power, they constructed the Black Pyramid, the largest structure ever built by mankind. Nagash supervised the construction, and although it cost a great many lives to build, the blood, sweat, and souls of those that died were a small price in his eyes. The original purpose of the pyramid was meant to attract as much dark magic into Khemri as possible, using either the winds of magic or the souls of the dead to fuel its growing power. For the priest kings of the other cities, long disturbed by events in Khemri, this was the final blasphemy. Under the leadership of King Lahmizar of the city-state of Lahmian, the other priest kings gathered their powerful armies and formed a coalition to stop Nagash's tyranny. A bloody war broke out, where waves of dark magic surged out from the Black Pyramid and blasted the lands of Nehekara. Once verdant plains of wheat slowly became tainted, and the life-giving waters of the land's many oases grew sickly and killed all that drank from it. After nearly a century of conflict, the armies of the priest kings shattered Nagash's power and sacked the capital city of Khemri. As Nagash fled the burning city into the cold depths of his pyramid, the great necromancer swore to the priest kings that he would return and enact his dire vengeance upon their descendants. The priest kings considered this an empty threat and laughed as their acolytes found Nagash's disciples within the pyramid and dragged them screaming to be burned and beheaded in the daylight sun. All of the morbid statues and monuments to Nagash's glory were toppled into the sands. The sanctums of the necromancer's disciples were plundered and despoiled. The practice of dark magic outlawed under the pain of death. Yet the agents of the priest kings could not find the renegade himself. Although his disciples claimed to have seen Nagash enter his sarcophages, the coffin itself was mysteriously empty. Unbeknownst to the priest kings, Nagash escaped and rebuild his power once more. To the far north, he had spent the better part of a century constructing a vast citadel, which he named Nagash. Located within a mountain known as Cripple Peak, Nagash sought to take advantage of the huge reserves of magic-saturated warpstone buried beneath its roots to fuel his already formidable powers. The Skaven, also desiring the warpstone, tried many times to sack Nagash and take Cripple Peak for their own. After nearly a century of attrition warfare, the war ended in a stalemate, for the Skavens could not overcome the formidable fortress, and Nagash could not drive them away. Recognizing the potential for mutual cooperation, Nagash negotiated an alliance with the Skaven, supplying them with warpstone in exchange for their aid with his plans. Before Nagash left for Cripple Peak, he made sure to leave behind agents of the mortuary cult within Nehekara to help in corrupting the minds of the nobility and lure them to his side. One such agent was Vesoran, the high priest of the city of Lahmian. Using his elevated position within Lahmian society, he was able to corrupt the mind of the young princess Neferatem, who was destined to become the next queen of Lahmian. Neferatem was a willful girl who grew fascinated with magic and death, but was frustrated by the mortuary cult's unwillingness to pass on their teachings to a woman. Vasora nurtured her thirst for the forbidden arts, coaching her in the magical knowledge he learned at Nagash's side. After the priest kings drove Nagash from Nehekara, Neferatem was all too willing to save several forbidden scrolls from the priest king's piles. After her father took Nagash's position as King of Khemri, Neferatem began her rule of Lahmian, and behind the locked doors of her palace, she studied the scrolls and began to emulate the simpler necromantic magics. All the while, Vesoran was testing the waters of Lahmia's mortuary cult, learning which priests were sympathetic to his cause and which would have to be dealt with in due time. Those who could not be twisted to the teachings of Nagash were warned of Neferatem's dark practices, a calculated act of betrayal that the queen would not learn of for many years. So it was that the priesthood fractured, some loyal to their queen and others set against her. This culminated in an attack on the palace, a rebellion that was only thwarted when Neferatem herself emerged, surrounded by a crackling nimbus of dark energy, and unleashed the full fury of her burgeoning necromantic abilities on her foes. The remaining rebels were rounded up and executed, leaving only those in the mortuary cult whom Vesoran could trust. With their aid, Vesoran and Neferatem continued their studies, focusing on one ritual above all others: the creation of the elixir of life that had granted Nagash his immortality. They eventually found success, but in an unexpected form. The version of the elixir they created gave them immortality, but it also fundamentally changed the nature of their beings. They became the first vampires. As a consequence, the mortuary cult of Lahmian cut its ties with the mortuary priests of other cities and began a reformation of its principles, encouraging female priests to join. The temple was rebuilt using stones taken from the buildings of Khemri that were destroyed during Nagash's defeat, and the chambers of the temple glittered with gold and were decorated with statues and hieroglyphs telling the story of his rise to power. In time, this temple would be known as the Temple of Blood. The cults of the other gods found themselves falling out of favor, struggling to be heard at court, and forcing many to simply leave. Neferatem invited her cousin, Khalida Neferer, the warrior queen of Libaras, to join her cult. Khalida rejected her offer, suspicious of the changes going on in Lahmian and devout in her own worship of Asaf, the goddess of serpents. Worried that Khalida knew her secret, Neferatem accused her cousin of treason and attempted to assassinate her during a feast, drawing her into a duel before all the nobles of the Lahmian court. Neferatem's vampiric strength gave her victory, and whilst Khalida lay dying, the vampire bit her own tongue and kissed her cousin, transferring the vampire curse upon her. Devout Khalida prayed as she died, and her prayer was answered. Asaf drew the taint out of her blood and replaced it with poison, granting Khalida a holy death. It is said that although her death was holy, it was not complete, and Khalida lived on as the eternal guardian of Asaf's temple. Neferatem, thwarted in her attempt to gain a powerful ally, cast the remaining priests of the other gods out of Lahmian. During this period of change, Neferatem had been secretly feeding on the populace of her city, arousing the suspicion of Aborash, the love-struck captain of her palace guards. Aborash was horrified to discover his love's true nature, but he was still duty-bound to obey her commands as she was still the queen of Lahmian. Neferatem tricked Aborash into drinking from the elixir of life, turning him into a vampire, much to his disgust. Neferatem and Vesoran then continued to spread their curse to many within the Lahmian court this way, including Chief Judge Mahtmesis and the court vizier Harakt. So began her deathless court, the true-born who would become the masters of the lesser vampires they created. Aborash still felt twinges of his humanity from his former life, and created a set of rules for the true-born to follow, ostensibly as a way of protecting themselves from discovery. They would only prey on criminals and slaves, not ordinary citizens from then on. Also, they were forbidden from feuding amongst themselves, and no Trueborn could ever try to kill another Trueborn. Thus, when Neferatem's brother, Ushoran, learned of the elixir and stole a draught of it for himself, she could not punish him, and Ushoran, the lowly lord of Maskes, was permitted to join the Deathless Court. Under its ageless queen, Lahmia became a city known for its religious intolerance and the harshness of its laws. Agents of the other cities began stirring up rebellion, horrified by the spread of the cult of blood and its veneration of Nagash. When the insurrection came, it was more brutally suppressed by Neferatem than the previous rebellion, earning her the name Neferata, meaning beautiful death. Although the rebellion failed, the other cities of Nehekara still wished for Lahmia's destruction. King Setep of Kemri, whose military legions had conquered lands as far north as the lands of the border princes, was foremost within this coalition. Amongst his soldiers was a masterful tactician called Vashanesh, who was of Nagash's own blood. Betraying Setep, Vashanesh traveled to Lahmia to warn them of this planned attack. Vashanesh so impressed Neferata that she gave him the last of the elixir of life, which none have been able to recreate since, and made him her husband, king of Lahmia and co-ruler of its growing population of vampires. Together they plotted to keep the other cities of Nehekara distant from each other, creating a network of spies that split the nation for centuries, disrupting all attempts to unify the people against them. After centuries of uncontested rule, it was Al-Khadizar the Conqueror who finally managed to unite and mobilize the disparate armies of the land and bring war to Lahmia by invoking the names of the old gods of Nehekara. He laid siege to the city at the head of a mighty army comprised of warriors from all of the other city-states, as well as mercenaries and allies from the territories he had annexed from the lands of Araby and the Southlands. Arriving at the city, they were horrified to be met not only by the military of Lahmia, but also by an army of the dead raised from their rest by the vampire Vasoran. Fighting back their fear, Al-Khadizar's troops brought battle to the undead. Though outnumbered, the army of Lahmia could be continually replenished, the dead rising as soon as they fell. The vampire's mortal followers proved less reliable, however, and in time, traitors amongst the Lahmian ranks soon turned against their masters and allowed the Nehekarans to storm the city. The chariots of the Jackal squadron of Mahrak coated the streets with blood, and those vampires who did not flee were forced to do battle on the steps of the temple itself. Aborash led the defenses for a full week, withstanding the spells of Zandri's high priests and the alchemical fire of their war machines. Finally, the temple was burned to the ground, and Aborash was forced to flee with several of his sons in darkness. The last of his compassion for the living finally burned out of him. The other surviving vampires, including Neferata, Vesoran, Ushoran, Matmasis, and Harakt, fled north, where they came across a reborn Nagash in the midst of raising an undead army of his own. The Curse of the Vampire, from minus 1163 to 1152 IC. Nagash had not been idle and learned much about the art of necromancy and animating the dead during his time within Nagashizar, conceiving of a mad and deadly scheme that would turn the entire world into a necropolis filled only by the unquiet dead, where no action would be performed, no deed done save when he willed it. Nagash would be the lord over it all. It was no coincidence that the vampires came across Nagash. Through his agent Vesoran, Nagash had manipulated them from the beginning and lent them his magical aid from afar during the siege of Lahmian. When Neferata learned the full extent of Vesoran's manipulation, she was furious. Even more so than after Nagash's decision to pass her over and offer his distant relative, Vashanesh, the position as commander of his legions. Nagash had crafted a ring that would allow the vampire who wore it to return from the dead time and again. But through that ring, Nagash would be able to control all of vampire kind. Vashanesh foolishly accepted the ring, and at Nagash's command, the vampires led his undead army. The first step on Nagash's road to utter dominion was the elimination of his former homeland, Nehekara, for he wished to fulfill the bitter vengeance he vowed upon the priest kings for what they had done to him in the distant past. At his command, the vampires led his legions to war. On ships made of fused bone, the undead horde made its way from the Sour Sea down what future generations would call the Straits of Nagash, and finally back into the bitter sea of Nehekara's shores. The undead legions made landfall within the ruined ports of Lahmian and surged towards the priest king's domains, the exiled vampires spearheading the assault. However, Nagash had seriously underestimated his former countrymen. In the time of his absence, the lands of the Great Vitae River had become a mighty empire ruled by a single priest king, known by his people as Al-Khadizar the Conqueror. Al-Khadizar was the greatest general of his age, and his empire was at the zenith of its power. When the undead came, they found themselves opposed by a massive, unified and highly marshaled grand army consisting of warriors, legions of chariots, and hordes of cavalry. Moreover, the enchanters of the Great Kingdom had made progress in the arts of magic, particularly in the creation of animated war constructs. No easy victory was possible against them. Although at first the The vampires were eager to serve as Nagash's lieutenants to exact revenge on Al-Khadizar and regain Lahmian. It became apparent their survival was irrelevant to Nagash. He hurled them carelessly against the enemy as he would his mindless undead troops, and he cared not for rebuilding Lahmian. Instead, he sought to destroy all of Nehekara. Bound by the power of the ring, Vashanesh war, they were unable to disobey Nagash or even his second-in-command, Arkan the Black. The ensuing wars stained the sands of Nehekara red for many years. The vampires were mighty sorcerers and fell warriors, and they were determined to reclaim their kingdom. Wherever they appeared, terror and dread came upon the enemy, and yet the vampires, for all their claims of power and immortality, could still be cast down to the cold furrow of death. The war raged for a decade. At first, the legions of the undead had the upper hand. Then, the armies of Al-Khadizar struck back with displays of tactical genius. Finally, Vashanesh concocted an ingenious solution to the problem of Nagash's enslavement. Suspecting the control Nagash exerted relied on a vampire wearing the ring and believing the great necromancer's assurances that it would return him from the grave. Vashanesh allowed Al-Khadizar to cut him down at the height of a battle. The vampires were freed from their control, and only the Soran remained. The others scattered and returned to the fortress of Nagashizar. So great was Nagash's rage that he cursed his vampiric captains, making all those bearing their blood unable to bear the rays of the sun. Ever afterwards, they would know constant pain from their unforgiving master, as their howling cries would carry the knowledge of their misery to all men. The Soran stayed by Nagash's side, whilst he cursed and ranted at the fickleness of vampires. The remaining vampires fled Nagashizar by night, dispersing in all directions to confuse pursuers. Even after Nagash's death at the hands of Al-Khadizar, the vampires bore his curse. Thus, the first vampires disappeared across the world, founding their own bloodthirsty dynasties that would endure and grow through the centuries, terrorizing the living to the present day. The Vampire Wars. The reign of the von Carsteins. When the vampires fled the wrath of Nagash, the majority went northwards into the lands of what would be known as the Old World. Once there, the 7 surviving vampire lords all went on their own separate journeys. One went to the far east, perhaps to the distant lands of Cathay, whilst another disappeared into the howling northern waste. The last 4 all stayed within different parts of the Old World. Queen Neferata took residence in a large peak within the World's Edge mountain that was known by the dwarves as the Silver Pinnacle, where she still resides today as the leader of the Lahmian bloodline. The Honorable Aborash fled to the northern regions of the Old World, where it is said that the vampire lord defeated and drank the blood of a mighty dragon, removing the loathsome curse of blood consumption. With the curse lifted, Aborash formed the first of the Blood Dragon bloodline. The scholarly Vasoran flung himself to all corners of the old world, where he still travels to this very day, gathering as much knowledge of necromancy as he possibly can in hopes of resurrecting his fallen master. It was during this time that he also founded the Necrarch bloodline. The cunning Ushorak founded the Strigoi bloodline, after he helped a necromancer named Kadon establish the ancient human kingdom of Strigos and its capital city of Murkane, long before the founding of the empire. But perhaps the greatest and most dangerous of the bloodlines to have ever plagued the human realms in the old world is one that started with one man and his ambition grown so great that it had the potential to topple an entire empire. Vashanesh eventually returned to life as Nagash promised, and he spent the next few centuries testing the limits of the ring. He set about mastering certain magical arts to make the ring his slave, rather than his master. Eventually, Vashanesh's ambitious nature led him on a dark path that would haunt the lands of Sylvania for the rest of eternity. The Madness of Otto von Drak, 1797 to 2000 IC. It all began on a storm-lashed night when Otto von Drak, the last of the mad von Drak counts, lay on his deathbed within the capital of Drakenhof, cursing the gods that he was without a male heir to continue his legacy. Otto was a cruel, gluttonous, and selfish man who delighted on the plight of others and whose authority over the land was met with little respect and less love by both commoners and nobility alike. While on his deathbed, the lands of Sylvania were seething with civil strife. As his family awaited his final breath, Otto swore to all the gods that he would rather marry his only daughter Isabella to a demon rather than to let his hated brother Leopold inherit the throne. The dying count refused all those that requested her hand in marriage, for in his heart he despised them all. And so it was that Isabella von Drak knelt at her father's deathbed, still without a husband and child to carry on the family estate. As if a dark power had answered the mad count's plea, outside the castle, thunder rumbled and lightning split the darkness. Victor Gutmann, the aged priest of Sigma who had been called to shrive the old count, fainted instantly. Then, from out of the storm, came the sound of wheels and pounding hooves. A dark coach pulled by 4 mighty black steeds stopped outside the keep. In the ensuing silence, someone knocked on the door. A trembling servant introduced an unknown noble to the count. The stranger introduced himself to the dying count and his daughter with respect, completely ignoring Leopold and only answering his questions regarding his origins by stating his name as Vlad von Carstein, the eldest of the von Carstein family, one he didn't expect Leopold to know. Leopold protested, but the stranger silenced him, stating he had come only to offer his services to the current Count von Drac, being in the vicinity whilst traveling to a wedding. Completely oblivious to his true intentions, Otto's face lit up, and he proposed the stranger to become the husband of his daughter, thus effectively removing Leopold's claim to the title of Count. Vlad then turned to Isabella, claiming that at some point of the ceremony it was usual for the bride to accept. Isabella, wanting the power she sensed in Vlad, accepted, but asked him in a whisper for a token of his love. Vlad then faced Leopold and tore his heart out of his chest with his bare hands before tossing him out of a window. He then presented Isabella the heart of her now dead uncle, upon which she coldly stated that she had no use for it, seeing as it no longer beated. The priest Gutmann was revived from his swoon and brought to the chambers of Otto, where the marriage ceremony was performed before the dying count's bed. Almost as soon as the last of the ritual words were spoken, Otto von Drac passed away, leaving his daughter and his entire estate in the charge of Vlad von Carstein. Thus the wedding ceremony had ended, and the two lovers were together ever since. Vlad von Carstein had married Isabella for power, and used his charm to control her at times. To their mutual surprise, what had started as a marriage of convenience swiftly blossomed into true love, and the pair had become confidants in one another and were all but inseparable. Isabella begged Vlad to give her the blood kiss so they could be together for eternity. But Vlad was aware to the downsides of vampirism and loved her too much to subject her to that. Scant days later, word reached Drachenhof that Isabella had fallen sick with an incurable illness. One of the physicians who tended her claimed her heart had stopped. The new count insisted this was not so. He dismissed the learned doctors, claiming he would care for her with his own hands. 3 days later, she appeared in front of her folk, saying she was fully recovered. She was ever afterwards pale and wan, however, and never left her chambers save by moonlight. Several months following Vlad's coronation, dark events had begun taking place across the lands. Young men and women from neighboring villages began disappearing overnight. Sightings of the dead stirring beneath their graves began to pop up within every cemetery across Sylvania. For whatever reason, these walking dead only attacked those that were defying the Count's authority. Those dissidents that had escaped them were found dead by strange accidents. All over Sylvania, these dark events occurred regularly, with only those who swore their allegiance to Vlad von Carstein seemingly immune to the horrific purge. Within 10 years, Vlad was more firmly in control of unruly Sylvania than any other ruler beforehand. Some remarked that so great was Vlad's achievement that he should in fact sit upon the imperial throne. To his naive subjects, the von Carsteins were, after all, an ancient family that could trace their lineage back to the founding of the Empire. Generations later, Vlad and Isabella still presided over the lands of Sylvania, unchanged. At first, few paid attention to their longevity. The lives of the peasants had always been squalid and short, and so they paid little heed. Although it was the longer-living nobility that began to notice this strange vitality. The revelation came about when the oldest woman in Drakenhof remarked how her great-grandmother was still a girl when Vlad von Carstein came into power. In time, word began to spread, leading to even the most dull-witted peasant realizing something was odd. Witch hunters by the dozen began to flock to the lands of Sylvania, hunting down evil like hounds upon a hare. Yet, of those that tried to investigate the von Carstein family, none had ever returned. Vlad and the First Vampire War, from 2010 to 2051, I see. In his former life, Vlad was not a cruel man at heart, but the curse and selfish pride that is usually brought about by vampirism had corrupted his body, mind, and soul. As with all vampires, the new Count of Sylvania was ambitious beyond mortal comprehension, and so he sought to instill his rule over not just Sylvania, but the whole of the Empire. At first, none of the feuding nobles of Sylvania paid any heed to the commands of this new Count. If this bothered Vlad, he gave no sign of it. The vampire count cherished his subjects the same way a peasant family would cherish a beast that they were fattening up for the midsummer feast. After decades of harsh rule by the incompetent Count Otto, this new authority was welcomed by all, save perhaps the most paranoid, or perhaps the most wise. The first signs that something big was coming came about when the disease that first took Isabella now took the rest of the Sylvanian nobility. Soon, every major castle was home to a family of long-living nocturnal vampires, pallid of aspect and arrogant in their rule. In time, the number of people who went missing grew exponentially. A mysterious sickness, not unlike the one that had killed Otto von Drac, had filled the graveyards of Sylvania, pushing the people to their limits and forcing the majority of the peasantry to turn their backs on the gods who would not help them and into the arms of the cult of the Wiederauferstandenen, known by many as the cult of the arisen dead. The holy temples of the old world pantheons were desecrated and closed, with the priest of Mor being driven out. Without the Mor priests to perform the proper burial rites, to bring the long deceased into their tombs and towards the afterlife, the bodies of the dead were simply piling up at the sides of the road, and their tormented spirits forced to live without rest. But probably the greatest and final sign of this impending darkness came when the Ostermark capital of Mordheim was destroyed by a massive warpstone meteorite in the year 2000 IC. The city of Mordheim was once the capital of the imperial province of Ostermark, where the faithful and pious gathered to witness the second coming of Sigmar Heldenhammer. But after some time, the city grew into a cesspit of decadence, greed, and widespread corruption. When the city was obliterated in 2000 IC by a massive meteorite, shards of warpstone were found all over the ruins of the city. Unaware of its chaotic origins, claimants of the imperial throne sent mercenary companies into the city to gather as much warpstone as they possibly could, hoping to manipulate its false properties of healing or turning lead into gold for their own personal uses. Vlad followed up on this as well, sending in his dark minions to gather as many of these shards as possible. Finally, on Geheimnisnacht Eve of the Imperial Year of 2010 IC, Vlad von Carstein thought the time ripe for the next step in his master plan. It was then, at the beginning of the winter, that the Count called forth all the nobles of the province to pledge loyalty to him during a festivity called the Totentanz, or the Dance of the Dead. The dance was to be held at Drachenhof Castle on the eve of Geheimnisnacht. The Totentanz was actually a ploy invented by Vlad to assemble the remaining living aristocracy in one place. At the height of the ball, he gave an order to his minions to close off the entrance and kill every living thing inside. Only 2 people left the throne room alive: Alten Gans, loyal human servant of Vlad who had suspected the true nature of his master plan, and Stefan Fischer, a witch hunter who had been chasing one of von Carstein's vampires for the murder of his wife alongside another witch hunter named Jon Skelan, his brother-in-law. During this event, Skelan was killed and turned into a vampire, but Fischer managed to hide under a pile of dead corpses to avoid being caught. With his deed enacted, the Count of Sylvania stood upon the battlements of Castle Drachenhof and performed a terrible incantation from one of the 9 books of Nagash. Fueled by the magic-saturated warpstones recovered from Mordheim, the necromancy spell flowed over to the unguarded cemeteries of the Gardens of Mor, and in an instant, all throughout the province, the dead began to stir. Slowly, every single cadaver in Sylvania began to move towards Drachenhof to answer the call of the Vampire Count. As the dead nobles started to emerge from the throne room, Stefan Fischer acted like a zombie and escaped the Drachenhof with only one single thought in mind: they are coming. Fischer finally escaped the deadly trap Sylvania had become, only to fall into the claws of a small band of vampires traveling through the Empire. Accepting his fate, even feeling joy for being soon reunited with his wife, Fischer was content to finally meet his end when suddenly he was saved by a small detachment of Countess Ottila's army sent to investigate reports of undead activity along the Sylvanian border. Fisher thus relayed the truth regarding the vampire count's true nature. Feeling all sense had fled his life, he stayed with Ottila's army as they tried to fend off the undead army at the Battle of Essen Ford, which would be the first conflict of the Vampire Wars. The battle at Essen Ford was considered a total Imperial massacre. Knee-deep in the mud and overwhelmed by impossible odds, the human army was easily swept away. At the end of the battle, Fisher came across his brother-in-law, John Skellan. When the prisoners were lined up before the vampire count, Vlad showed them the extent of his power. While speaking with the leader of the army detachment, he invited first guns, then 3 vampires, including Skellan, to kill a prisoner of their choosing. Skellan chose Fisher and bled him dry, thus reuniting him with his dead wife. Vlad reanimated each of the dead Imperials, then asked the still living Imperial commander of this defeated army to choose one of his men to live. The latter refused, not wanting judgment over the life or death of any but his own. The vampire count thus chose the youngest of the prisoners and announced that he alone would live to spread the fear of the vampires throughout the empire. He then freed the prisoner, who ran for his life away from the undead army. In this moment of destruction, the Imperial commander took Vlad's sword and beheaded the Count with a swift stroke. Hermann Prosner severed the commanders an instant afterwards, but it was too late, for the Vampire Count was no more. Not long after, Prosner remarked that the body of the Count had disappeared. Dismissing it as trivial, he started a brutal rise to power, slaying everyone opposing him. It had been the loyal servant Guns who had taken the body away, incapable of accepting the death of his beloved Count. At the end of the night, Prosner had obtained control of the undead army and was going to get the last thing which would truly cement his power: the widow Isabella. The latter, totally hysterical, was smiling when Hermann Prosner entered her tent. She claimed that her beloved wasn't dead and that he would come back for her. Gently, Hermann Prosner led Isabella out of the tent and claimed her before the whole army as his bride by right of strength. From the back of the crowd, someone answered the challenge. The undead all stepped away from the one who had spoken, and there stood Vlad von Carstein. He had been saved by a family heritage, an old signet ring obtained in his earlier life, which granted the wielder true immortality. In the following duel, Vlad defeated Prosner and laid him low. Seeing his death inevitable, Prosner hurled his sword away, killing loyal Guns in the process. The Count then prepared to strike him down, but was stopped by Isabella, who claimed that right for herself. The Count gave his sword to her, and she killed Hermann Prosner in cold blood. The war continued after the events of Essen Ford. For more than 40 years, the dark shade of the Count put an aura of terror above the Empire. Countless times he was struck down in battle, and each time he rose again to kill those who had defeated him. At the Battle of Bluthof, he fell impaled by 5 lances, with the Count of Ostland's runefang buried to the hilt in his heart, yet reappeared 3 days later, overseeing the execution of prisoners. Whilst at the town of Bergenhafen, he led his undead army to victory after being decapitated by a cannon only an hour before. When in the spring of 2050 IC, the city of Middenheim was attacked and the Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf, Jarek Kruger, was turned into a vampire because he had dared to kill the Count at the Battle of Schwarzhafen a year before. All hope seemed lost to the Imperials, and eventually the undead army now marched towards the last thing between them and victory: the Imperial capital of Altdorf. When the undead army arrived before the walls of Altdorf, they found the city was well prepared. The Reich had been diverted to surround the city, harvests had been stockpiled, and the walls had been manned. However, the powers of Vlad proved enormous. In a shocking display of Kabbalistic power, he covered the sky in clouds and awoke every dead beneath the plain surrounding Altdorf. Huge siege engines formed of zombies were thrown against the city walls, and in time, the dead soon outnumbered the living. There was no hope of victory for mankind. In search of divine aid, the Grand Theogenist Wilhelm III retreated into the catacombs of the Cathedral of Altdorf to pray. It was in that holy place that he received a visit from none other than Mannfred von Carstein, the eldest thrall of Vlad. Mannfred wanted the power of the vampire count for himself, but he knew that he wasn't strong enough to challenge Vlad in combat. So he informed Wilhelm III about the secret of the Count's immortality. The priest then set an elaborated trap to catch the best thief of the age, Felix Mann. When they caught him robbing the Imperial counting house, they gave him a simple choice: to rob Vlad von Carstein's signet ring or to be hung for his crimes. In exchange for the theft, he would be paid enough to start anew elsewhere. Felix accepted the charge, and with a little aid from Mannfred von Carstein, robbed the Count of his most precious belonging. When the Count awakened, his anger was uncontrollable. In one frantic attack, Vlad threw everything he had against Altdorf. There, on the battlements, he confronted Wilhelm III and eventually overcame him. With his last breath, the great Theogenist threw himself against the undead Count, and both fell off the walls. While the fall wouldn't have killed a vampire as powerful as Vlad, they both fell on a wooden stake, the vampire trapped beneath the corpse of the holy man. Immediately after the death of Vlad, his army dissolved and the Altdorfers rejoiced, for finally, the horrors of the First Vampire War were over. Conrad, and the Second Vampire War from 2058 to 2121 IC. The war had ended, and Vlad's dream of an undead empire was dead alongside him, while the horrors perpetrated by his unholy campaign would still stalk mankind's worst nightmares for centuries to come. The vampire threat hadn't been routed. The vampires had indeed fled into the woods and were returning to their power base within Sylvania, but still, 2 of Vlad's lieutenants were alive, and enough direct descendants to assure the continuation of his line. Jarek Kruger, a warrior with experience commanding, managed to shepherd the surviving vampires back to Sylvania. He would, however, never try to obtain the position of Count. Another vampire by the name of Skelan had been captured by the Altdorfers and was imprisoned in a crypt beneath the Cathedral of Altdorf, where they kept him as a prisoner for many years afterwards. Felix Munn, wanting to claim his reward, discovered that with no physical proof of the deal he had with the Grand Theogenist, no one would believe he had committed the theft on behalf of the Holy Man. Wronged and angered, Felix stole one of Vlad's books of Nagash, but while fleeing from the Sigmarites, he became aware that someone was following him from the shadows. When Felix was finally cornered by the stranger in a back alley, he tried to buy him off with the dead Count's signet ring. The stranger, who was in fact Mannfred von Carstein, severed the 2 hands of the thief, took the ring and the book, and left Felix for dead. Thus, Vlad's artifacts passed on to a vampire and necromancer of almost equal power. Isabella von Carstein would be taken captive the very next night when they caught her trying to find her husband's body, which had been buried beneath the Theogenist's grave. She was completely hysterical and had lost all touch with reality. She would eventually commit suicide when the Lector of Sigma, in an attempt at pity, told her Vlad was really dead and would not come back. Following Vlad's death, only 5 vampires claimed to be the heir to his legacy. These vampires were Fritz, Hans, Peter, Conrad, and Mannfred von Carstein. For more than 40 years afterwards, the vampires of the von Carstein line fought a vicious power struggle against each other, giving the Empire vital time to recover from the desolation brought about by Vlad's invasion. In time, Fritz von Carstein was killed on the field of battle when he foolishly attempted to besiege the massive fortress city of Middenheim. Hans von Carstein perished when Conrad instigated a quarrel between them over who was the toughest amongst them. Peter was slain in his coffin by a vengeful witch hunter by the name of Helmut von Hahn, a distant descendant of an ancient and powerful necromancer from the time of the Skaven Wars. It is said that Mannfred von Carstein had also aided in his death. After Peter's death, Mannfred von Carstein disappeared from Sylvania, leaving Conrad as the new and undisputed ruler of all of Sylvania. In time, Conrad began the Second Vampire War, much to the Empire's dismay. Whilst Vlad von Carstein was patient, Conrad von Carstein was simply a mad butcher, evil, merciless, and insanely violent. Lacking the necromantic skills of his predecessor, Conrad was forced to enslave any magicians he could capture and force them to do his bidding as powerful necromancers. Once more, the vampire counts of Sylvania rampaged across the lands of the Empire. Indeed, Conrad was beyond bloodthirsty, even amongst his own kin. Vlad offered his opponents a choice between servitude or death. Conrad offered them a choice between dying quickly or dying slowly. The former count's ambition was to rule as the vampire emperor of the Empire. Conrad's single motivation was to simply indulge himself in endless slaughter. His warmongering nature took his army to the far south of the Empire, where he came into contact with the Blood Knights of Blood Keep, the bearers of the Blood Dragon bloodline. With these knights folded into his ranks, Conrad was able to destroy all those who would dare to oppose him, even given Conrad's complete lack of strategic planning, hysteria, and grave tactical errors. At the Battle of Kleiberstorf, however, Conrad faced a powerful Avalander army that contained a massive wagon train of long-range artillery. When battle commenced, the Avalander artillery was merciless towards the slow-moving Sylvanian army. In desperation, Conrad threatened, bribed, and pleaded with his necromancers to keep his army moving forward. He offered power and riches to his captive wizards, and they acceded, combining their powers to unleash a scourging wind on the Avaland army. Dark magic swept across the Imperial ranks, and in a short time, the Imperial soldiers began to feel their souls being clawed by ethereal hands. Panic began to spread as the unnatural gale stripped the life of the Imperial soldiers one by one. In a rare moment of tactical genius, Conrad saw that the moment was ripe for a counterattack and sent his elite squadron of Blood Knights and Drakenhov Templars into the fray. Faced with incomprehensible terrors and armored vampires, the Avaland army broke and fled. Conrad, like the bloodthirsty creature he was, hounded the Imperial soldiers for 5 days and 5 nights, ensuring that all those that participated in the battle were hunted down and killed to the very last man. In his overzealous pride and need to draw more blood, the Vampire Count had instigated a bloody war with the dwarves, against the cautious advice of his few remaining advisors, attacking isolated villages and surface settlements within the domains of Zufbar. The Dwarf King of Zufbar himself finally had enough, and mustered a grand army to punish the vampire for his wrongdoings. Seeing a new challenge, the vampire met the dwarf army at the town of Nachthafen. In the battle, the dwarven runesmiths countered the necromantic spells of Conrad's enslaved necromancers with ease. Robbed of their sustaining power, the skeletal warriors and zombies of Conrad's army lay where they fell, blasted apart by a massive barrage of cannons and mortar artillery. Conrad remained confident despite the setbacks and launched an all-out assault on the dwarves' right flank. Leading the assault himself, the vampire drove directly towards the cadre of runesmiths, whilst his blood knights smashed into the disciplined ranks of dwarf warriors. Conrad slew the runesmiths personally, drinking their spilled blood and giving his captive necromancers the time they needed to resurrect the fallen. It was a hopeless battle, but the dwarves still fought stubbornly until the very end. Their own king had challenged the Blood Count to personal combat, but instead of accepting, Conrad dispatched Valach Harkon, the Grand Master of the Blood Knights, to fight as his champion. Though the duel was bitter close, the Grand Master finally killed the Dwarf King with a mighty blow and gorged himself on royal blood. Within the next hour, the last of the dwarves were all dead. Conrad was so unwavering and vicious in his undead assault that, confronted with a common enemy, the three claimants to the imperial throne had put aside their differences and combined their mighty armies into one titanic force with which to oppose him. At the Battle of the Four Armies, the three imperial grand armies stood united against the undead army of Conrad just outside the fortress city of Middenheim. This battle became infamously known for the great betrayal by two of the imperial leaders. Emperor Ludwig and Empress Attila IV attempted to assassinate each other during the battle, a disgusting gesture that forced the other imperial counts to select another candidate to lead this new coalition. A conclave of the Elector Counts assembled themselves within Averheim, where they decided that Helmut of Marienburg would be a prime candidate to be the new emperor. Even as support for him grew within the council hall, Helmut began to act erratically, struck dumb and vacant at a critical time. Eventually, Helmut's skin began to peel off, and his eyes suddenly popped out of his own skull. Even Helmut's son, Helmar, refused his father's claim to the throne once it was discovered that his father was killed and turned into a zombie under Conrad's control. With his ploy failing, Conrad went into a rage and slaughtered his way from Averheim into the Howling Hills, putting to the torch every town and village that stood in his way. Finally, having enough of Conrad's sadistic invasion, all of the remaining Elector Counts and Dwarf Lords joined forces once more upon the Battle of Grimmoor during the spring of 2121 IC. Arrogantly, Conrad once again made a headlong charge against the fully arrayed armies of all the Elector Counts and Dwarf warriors under their hero, Grufbad. Although his elite corps of warriors had managed to endure the punishment, a strange event began to occur. In that instant, the regiments of the undead began to falter, with the magic that bound them together seeping away. The enslaved necromancers finally had enough of Conrad's sadistic rule and fled the battlefield without a second glance. Seeing the battle was lost, the terrified Blood Knights retreated as well, hoping to escape the vengeful dwarves and Imperials. In desperation, The magically inept Conrad tried to hold the undead army together by himself. But the effort proved too much to bear, and Conrad's mind finally snapped. In a mad fit, Conrad wandered away from the battle while his undead army began to disintegrate, shouting maniacally as his mind lay shattered. Conrad wandered the forest for some time, until he was ambushed by Grufbad, who captured the vampire and held him down as the newly elevated Elector Count Helmar impaled his father's killer with his own runefang. With Conrad's death, the Second Vampire War was finally over, and in time, the Elector Counts began to squabble amongst themselves once more. Mannfred and the Third Vampire War, from 2124 to 2145 IC. With the death of Conrad, the last contender for Vlad's position was Mannfred von Carstein. Whilst Vlad was the most powerful and Conrad was the most violent, Mannfred was by far the most cunning and perhaps the most magically gifted of the entire bloodline. During the time of the Second Vampire War, Mannfred left Sylvania and traveled to the dead lands of Nehekara to seek out necromantic artifacts of great power. He spent the next century reading through forbidden books, and by the time Mannfred returned to Castle Drakenhov, he soon possessed an entire library of dark lore. Being the last of the von Carstein bloodline, Mannfred became the undisputed ruler of Sylvania. For a full decade, he had bid his time wisely and allowed the Imperial contenders to believe that the threat of Sylvania was truly over. Where Vlad had ruled through his iron will and raw power, and Conrad reigned with violence and fear, Mannfred used his necromantic powers and devious manipulations to forge his new undead armies. He sought out vampires from beyond the borders and bribed, coerced, and flattered them into his new retinue. He spent many long months in the wilderness of the Empire, rousing spirits and wights from their decrepit tombs and desecrating cemeteries for corpses. When vicious civil war racked the Empire once again, Mannfred deemed it was time to finally strike. His undead army crossed the Sylvanian border in the depths of winter. With the summer campaigning season over, the armies of the Elector Counts were already disbanded and were completely unprepared for this sudden assault. Mannfred's armies marched through the snows towards Altdorf, putting to the sword any living men they met, and raising the corpses to swell the ranks of his horde. In the infamous Winter War of 2132 IC, Mannfred defeated several hastily assembled Imperial armies that attempted to block his path to the capital. Victory followed victory, and soon the rumor of Mannfred's coming was enough to send villagers fleeing from their homes, only to freeze to death in the cold winter snow. When his massive legions reached Altdorf, they found the city seemingly undefended. Triumph filled Mannfred. He looked set to become not a vampire count, but a vampire emperor, achieving what Vlad and Conrad had failed to do. Then, the Grand Theogenist, Kurt III, appeared on the battlements of the city. The Sigmarite High Priest had brought forth the evil Liber Mortis from the deepest locked vaults of his temple, and began to recite the great spell of unbinding from its pages. As the incantation continued, Mannfred's power over his minions began to weaken. Seeing his followers begin to crumble to dust, Mannfred ordered a hasty retreat, for the hidden Imperial armies within Altdorf were mobilizing for a massive counterattack. Unperturbed, he marched his army along the River Reich downstream and into the port city of Marienburg, capturing several large vessels along the way and manning them with the raised corpses of their crews. Mannfred's initial plan was to lay siege to the port city and then sail his zombie fleet through Marienburg's primary rivers and canals that cut directly through the city and attack from their river ports. In desperation, the entire city was roused to the defense, and in time, the first undead assault upon the ports was repulsed. Unable to make a beachhead within the riverways, Mannfred began construction of massive siege towers and catapults within the outskirts of the city. However, scouts reported to him that a massive Imperial army was hounding them all the way from the city of Altdorf. Realizing he could not win this siege, he promptly retreated. So began a long cat-and-mouse chase that encircled the entire empire, with neither side entirely sure which one was the cat. At Horstenbad, the armies of Ostermark were able to surround and ambush Mannfred as his army wound its way along the forest road, destroying nearly half of his forces. Yet he escaped the slaughter, and within the month had seized the town of Felf and created a new army. On and on the campaign raged, with neither side able to secure the ultimate victory. Twice, Mannfred was forced to retreat to Sylvania in order to escape pursuit from his relentless enemies. Determined not to make the same mistakes as they had before, the nobility of the Empire had sworn a truce to finally rid the Empire of the vampire threat once and for all. United under a righteous cause, the entire military might of the Empire was brought forth, and in time, army after army was mustered from all the grand provinces for the Sylvanian campaign. To repay themselves for lost grudges, the High King of the Dwarfs also sent in armies of his own to reinforce the Imperials. Wave after wave of Imperial regiments were streaming into the Sylvanian borders like a massive river, scouring the dark woods and routing their foes. Eventually, the Imperial armies had forced Mannfred into a pitched battle within the treacherous marches of Helfen. At the Battle of Helfen, Mannfred's army was vast, his necromantic power having raised a legion of zombies from the muddy depths of Helfen itself. Mannfred's unliving host continued to retreat deeper into the swamps, drawing the exhausted Imperial armies onwards into the filth and gloom. Yet Mannfred was taken aback by the determination of his foes. Tirelessly, the Imperial and Dwarven armies continued to hound him until finally he was brought to battle at the eastern reaches of the marshlands, where the warriors of the Empire and the dwarves fought with grim resolve. He saw that victory was beyond his reach and attempted to flee. Elector Count Martin of Sturland, mounted upon a majestic griffon, gave chase and caught Mannfred at the very edge of the swamps. It is said that Vlad von Carstein, the former Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf, tore off Mannfred's arm, which contained the signet ring Vlad once wore to resurrect himself from the dead. Without this ring, Mannfred was now mortal. Though the Elector Count was wounded badly, his runefang cleaved great gouges into Mannfred's flesh, and the vampire's mangled corpse sank into the depths of the swamp. Despite a long search, neither human nor dwarf ever located Mannfred's body, but unbeknownst to them, Mannfred von Carstein was truly dead. Thus ended the reign of Mannfred, the last of the von Carsteins, and the final end of the Vampire Wars once and for all. Or so the Empire had thought. Although Mannfred truly died at the Battle of Helfen, an odd turn of events came about that resurrected him from the grave. A necromancer by the name of Stillman was within the vicinity of his buried corpse when he was suddenly killed by a group of hunters, of which included the famous duo Gotrek and Felix. The blood of the necromancer dripped loosely and flowed into the roots of a tree where Mannfred's body lay. With enough blood going back into his body, he was able to rise once more. Mannfred, hell-bent on taking the Imperial throne for himself and ruling over the old world, even if it took an eternity to do so, has bided his time since his defeat at Helfen. Over the years leading up to his re-emergence, he traveled far and wide to secure allies. Once his studies with the disciples of Nagash in the ruins of Lahmian had come to completion, his magical abilities had never been stronger. Yet the von Carstein's plans were ambitious indeed. In return for their secrets, Mannfred had sworn a dread pact with the corrupted Wraith wizards that yet served Nagash in the south. A pact to aid them in their own goal of summoning the great necromancer once more and bringing a new order to the world. The von Carsteins had secretly been working towards this same goal for centuries following the death of the rebellious Vlad von Carstein. Though great progress had been made, their efforts had ultimately fallen short, for in truth, Nagash had become more like a god than a man, and his spirit was beyond even the abilities of the vampire counts to bring to the mortal realm. It would take the rituals of ancient Nehekara combined with the sacrifice of a powerful and innocent soul to achieve a true resurrection. Mannfred, in his genius, saw a way to hasten the return of Nagash and seriously weaken those who would stand against him in one stroke.